On behalf of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, welcome to the National Gang Center's Strategies to Reduce Gang Violence in Juvenile Justice Settings webinar. As a reminder, the opinions, findings, and conclusions of the moderator and presenters today are their own. As we get started, I would like to go ahead and welcome our moderator for today, Mina Harris, who is the Director of the National Gang Center and Executive Vice President of the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. Welcome, Mina.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For this webinar, the National Gang Center has teamed up with the Council of Juvenile Justice Administrators and the Annie E. Casey Foundation to talk about strategies for reducing gang violence in juvenile justice facilities. Debate continues over academic, legal, and practical definitions over what is a gang and who should be labeled a gang member, which can create stigma and unfair collateral consequences throughout an individual's life course. These debates are valid and should continue, but gangs, sometimes referred to as cliques, crews, sets, or groups, they are a reality and distinguishable from other patterns of violence. When their activities are criminal and or violent, it becomes a serious threat to the safety of others, to the public space. In addition, despite the fact that youth often report joining a gang to seek protection from victimization, gang-involved youth are actually at a significantly higher risk for victimization than their non-gang peers. While the number of youth in residential placement has declined significantly over the past decades, youth with histories of gang membership or gang affiliation are overrepresented among youth in residential facilities relative to youth in the United States as a whole. The presence of youth gangs in juvenile residential facilities contribute to increased behavioral issues. Studies based on the survey of youth in residential placement revealed that the presence of gangs in a facility was significantly related to the percentage of youth who said they had been offered contraband and the percentage of youth who reported feeling pressured by the gang to do things they normally would not do. These same studies found in-facility gang affiliation was related to significantly higher rates of violent and non-violent victimization compared with non-gang youth, regardless of whether a youth joined in the facility or had maintained continuous membership throughout the transition from the community to the facility. Safety, well-being, and transformations for youth success are all priority issues. When we layer the complexity of gang-related patterns of behavior into this, it's necessary to address it head-on. Let us know in the chat, what are some of the biggest challenges you are facing in your facilities? For today's webinar, we'll begin with a presentation followed by a question and answer session. We want to meet three objectives. Our presenters will evaluate the need for changes in custodial settings to better address challenges associated with gang involvement. They will discuss research and resources on effective strategies and promising practices to support youth involved with gangs and juvenile justice settings. For those questions received through registration that do not fall within the scope of this topic, we will post additional resources in the chat where you can reach out to the National Gang Center and those on the panel for your additional inquiries. And third of our objectives, our presenters will summarize practical considerations for improving gang reduction efforts in the juvenile system. So now it's time to introduce our esteemed panelists. Mike Dempsey is the Executive Director of the Council of Juvenile Justice Administrators. He has more than 30 years of experience working in both adult and juvenile correctional and detention facility settings and continues to be committed to assisting juvenile justice systems on improving conditions of confinement, reforming systems, and improving long-term outcomes for youth. Tanya Washington is a senior associate with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Through her work in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group, she manages the developing state strategy to reduce the number of youth in juvenile systems confined in deep-end residential placements. As part of this initiative, she works to identify and implement policy options that will minimize eligibility for confinement, improve decision-making, and increase options for addressing the needs of youth and communities. Felix Mickens is a management professional with more than 25 years of experience in juvenile justice. He has an extensive background in planning and managing cross-functional corrections operations. He is currently Chief Executive Officer of Mickens and Associates, but previously served as Deputy Executive Director for operations for New Jersey Juvenile Justice Commission. Sharon Pett is Chief Executive Officer of Effective Systems Innovations and has 25 years of professional experience in juvenile justice and child welfare systems in the United States. As an independent consultant, she has led dozens of state governments, city governments, and large not-for-profit agencies in transforming their systems and improving outcomes for youth and families. Mike and Tanya, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mina. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on strategies to reduce gang violence in juvenile justice settings. This toolkit is the result of a collaboration between CJJA and the Annie Casey Foundation. It is meant to provide a comprehensive resource to juvenile justice administrators and direct care staff. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the agencies and partners at the National Gang Center for their support on this topic, and special thanks to all the CJJA staff, consultants, and partners who dedicated their time in assisting with this project. In particular are Felix Mickens and Sharon Pett, who will be presenting on today's webinar. This toolkit was created to provide a comprehensive framework for effectively addressing gang issues in juvenile justice facilities. Managing gang-related behaviors and resulting violence is one of the most challenging aspects of facility operations. If left unchecked, gang activities can jeopardize facility security and the safety of both staff and youth in your facility. As we were working on the toolkit, we also came to realize that there's a lack of research, particularly any recent research on this topic. There's clearly a need for more in-depth research and data to help better guide facility practices and to improve long-term outcomes for youth entrusted to your care. Gang activities has a significant impact on both staff and youth within secure custody settings. It impacts the overall culture of the facility, perpetuates violence, and negatively impacts staff and youth safety and wellness. Gang violence leads to heightened fear for safety among staff and youth, resulting in increased tension and conflict, violence, and even increased incidents of sexual victimization. The Bureau of Justice Statistics working paper on facility level and individual level correlates of sexual victimization in juvenile facilities from 2012 states facilities with higher rates of staff sexual misconduct have problems related to gang membership. Facilities with more than half the youth with a history of gang membership and affiliation were more likely to have more incidents of staff sexual misconduct. There is a strong correlation between gang-related incidents and staff turnover, which can exacerbate the problem by leading to vacancies and inadequate staffing levels. At a minimum, these challenges disrupt therapeutic interactions and interventions, hindering rehabilitation efforts for youth in your care. With that, I will turn it over to Tanya.
I don't have too much to add. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to CJJA and to Sharon and Felix for all their efforts in putting together this toolkit. My interest as a part of Casey is in helping to understand how to support superintendents and states as they try to address young people who are in their custody, while also providing transformation. So I have been doing technical assistance in New Jersey, and the main thing that I've learned over the past 4 years is that young people who have been gang involved and who are in custody and committing violent activities, that it's important for you all to understand their status in their gang. Affiliated or identity is not enough. And so I think if you bring bring that lens to the table, understand whether they're the leaders, the shot callers, or whether they are the ones who are following, will help you get the best out of this toolkit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mike and Tanya. So I'd like to start off just by sharing with you a little bit about the development of the toolkit briefly, and then take the opportunity to highlight some of the research and concepts related to reducing gang activity and incidents of violence in secure juvenile justice facilities. So as Mike explained, the idea for this toolkit came as a direct response to inquiries from CJJA members and stakeholders who were looking for some guidance on how to interrupt the trend of increasing gang violence that was occurring in their facilities. And so many administrators reported, using single or sole source strategies such as classification or separation, but these interventions alone were not effective at preventing or reducing gang activity. And so we set out to develop, as Mike and Tanya said, a really comprehensive strategy that was grounded in research and that would also provide some real life policy and practice recommendations that facility administrators could use to address the persisting gang issues. And so it took about 1.5 years to develop the toolkit, which was published May of last year. And we provided a QR code here on your screen so participants can access the full toolkit in their free time. And this will allow us to kind of focus our efforts today, focusing on some of the key concepts that the research has shown, and then mostly spend a lot of time, one, on the practical application of the research, and also answering questions from the audience. So, all right. So the development of the toolkit obviously involved conducting a deep dive into research on gangs, and as Mike mentioned, as we were kind of combing through all the research, there was very little research specific to youth gangs and facilities. The overwhelming body of research was focused on gangs and communities and adult gangs. And so I think this scarcity of research is important to mention because the lack of information specific to youth gangs kind of prompted us to broaden the lens through which we explored the research. So ultimately, we were kind of corralled into considering research findings from a variety of studies, including gangs in the community, gangs in adult correctional facilities, and youth gangs in school settings. And this actually turned out to be kind of a blessing in disguise because it really allowed us to develop a very comprehensive framework that reflected best practices from a variety of studies in various settings. And so in addition to presenting best practices research, we also wanted to provide information from facility administrators that would allow us to better understand how big of an issue this gang problem was, and also help us identify effective practices that are currently being used to address these issues. And so we developed a quantitative and a qualitative survey, which 15 jurisdictions in the United States completed. And then we also conducted several follow-up focus groups with these juvenile justice leaders to gather additional information. And so you'll see this information interspersed throughout the toolkit. And then the final source that kind of fed the development of this toolkit is youth voice. We knew that it was really important for us to include information from youth who had real life experience. And so we interviewed a handful of former gang-involved youth to ask them about the factors that led them to their gang involvement and what were those factors that eventually helped them abandon the gang lifestyle. And so this information you will also see in the toolkit. So here are a few of the topics that are covered in the toolkit. Understand that this is not a complete list. The toolkit itself is actually 100 pages long, but we structured it in a way that makes it easier to navigate based on your area of interest. And so the first 10, 12 pages or so is the executive summary. And what we did is actually embedded links into the executive summary so folks can click on a topic in the executive summary, and then they would basically instantly be brought to that section of the toolkit where they would have more detailed information is provided. So this hopefully makes the toolkit a little less daunting from a user's perspective. And again, the goal of the toolkit was not just to present research on gangs in a neatly wrapped package, but we really wanted to provide those real life practice considerations, those actions that would allow facilities to apply the research in their day-to-day operations. So as such, we basically created in each of those topic areas, whether it be push-pull factors or assessments or data or treatment, in each of those topic areas, we created subsections within each of those areas called policy and practice considerations. So this is where the basically boots on the ground guidance lies for juvenile justice practitioners. So hopefully you'll find that valuable. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time together today, but I want to share some information about two of the most critical concepts and research related to gang reduction strategies. These are push and pull factors, as well as gang embeddedness. And then after I present, Felix will talk to us a little bit about the operational pieces of this. All right, so let's start with push-pull factors. So push-pull factors are those factors that influence whether a youth will become gang involved. And these factors have been studied extensively by Dr. David Pyruz out of the University of Colorado in Boulder. So simply put, pushes are those negative factors that push youth into gangs. So push factors might be poverty, failing at school, familial and intergenerational gang involvement, impulsivity, or lack of self-control, for example. So those pulls, on the other hand, are those things that draw or attract youth to those gangs. So these are the factors that are associated with the perceived benefits of the gang lifestyle. So these can be the excitement of a gang, the possibility of making money, and or the promise of protection. So in most cases, there are several push-pull factors at play that cause a youth to adopt the gang lifestyle. And so it makes sense that the more risk factors a youth has, the greater likelihood a youth is going to join a gang. So I just want to take a moment here to emphasize why it's so important for juvenile justice professionals to understand what drives a youth to become gang involved. So research shows that many youth enter gangs around between the ages like 12, 13, up to 15. That's usually the age at which they enter. And so prior to youth entering these middle school years, we have so many opportunities to prevent gang involvement. And the truth is the youth do not wake up one morning and decide, I think I'm going to join a gang. It really is a progression that occurs over time. And so this is also the case when youth are leaving a gang. It's a process, not a point in time. And we'll talk a little bit more about strategies to support youth in moving away from the gang lifestyle in a bit. But the point I want to stress here is that prior to middle school, we can have a significant impact on preventing youth from becoming gang involved. So in the same way as juvenile justice practitioners, if we have youth in our facilities who are 13, 14, 15, 16, there's still a lot we can do to intervene and influence these youth and put them on a new trajectory. So examples of effective early intervention or prevention strategies are those that specifically, again, target these push-pull factors, such as providing education about gangs to staff and parents, providing tutoring, vocational training, and other academic supports to address the low academic performance of youth, increasing pro-social networks through formal mentoring programs using credible messengers, and addressing familial issues by providing the needed resources to parents, such as parenting skills, training, transportation vouchers, and job skills training. So those are just a few. Again, the toolkit has lots of pages all about some of those interventions, both in terms of early intervention and prevention strategies. But it's critical that facility staff identify these push-pull factors using formal assessment instruments, if possible, as part of their comprehensive gang strategies, because this will allow them to target the intervention specifically to address these factors. And again, Felix is going to talk to us a little bit more about assessments during his presentation. So the second concept that I wanted to touch on is, it's really important, just as important, I think, to understand as push-pull. But the second concept is embeddedness, this idea of gang embeddedness. And this concept, again, is one in which Dr. David Pyruz has studied quite a bit. And generally speaking, embeddedness is a term that is used to describe the degree of affiliation with a gang. So it's the degree to which a youth associates with the gang. So Dr. Pyruz has identified specific factors that help professionals determine how deeply ingrained a youth is in the gang lifestyle. And so he has them grouped into 4 categories here. You can see on the screen, we have status, associations, behaviors, and peers. And obviously, the more of these indicators that exist, the stronger the youth's affiliation with the gang. And I'm just going to kind of touch on these real briefly here. So status involves the individual's identity or position in the gang. So obviously, if a youth is in a leadership role in the gang, then they would be considered more embedded or more tied to the gang lifestyle. The association piece really refers to how much contact youth have with gang members and how many people whom they consider their friends are in the gang. So in the absence, obviously, of strong pro-social connections, a youth might be more susceptible to affiliate with deviant social networks. So this affiliation obviously grows in strength based on the number of deviant peers to which the youth is connected. And then the behavior piece involves ways in which youth express their loyalty or affiliation with the gang. So these can be, using gang symbols or numbers, flashing gang signs, or wearing gang colors, and participating in gang fights, to name a few. And that last category there, power, describes the degree of influence the gang member has over the gang and how much influence the gang has over other members. So again, if someone is viewed by other gang members as having a strong influence over other members, they're more likely to be more deeply rooted in the gang lifestyle. So there's only one formal assessment tool of which we are aware related to this topic of embeddedness. It's the SET, and that stands for Social Embeddedness Tool. It was created and piloted by the University of Southern California in 2013. And the SET allows staff to measure the degree of gang affiliation or embeddedness, either periodically through the program and upon program completion. And the instrument gathers information using structured interviews and focuses mainly on client attitudes and behaviors. And I want to mention this concept of embeddedness is important because it provides a framework for developing approaches that will assist youth in extricating themselves from the gang lifestyle. So I want to talk a bit more about how youth exit gangs. Okay, so here are a few important research findings. So first, as I mentioned earlier, research shows that most youth join gangs between the ages of 13 and 15. So again, there are years of opportunity to target known push-pull factors to help prevent youth from joining a gang. The second piece is that research shows that most gang members, at least 70%, will leave the gang within 2 years. And that most youth will age out of gangs by their early 20s without having any formal intervention. So essentially, they leave the gang on their own accord. So based on research by Dr. Peruz, the most common reason people leave the gang is disillusionment. And gang members get tired. Basically, gang members get tired of the violence. They get tired of the criminal justice system. They get tired of people snitching on them. Ultimately, they feel they've kind of been duped. As Dr. Pyru says, they've been sold a bill of goods. Basically, the gang promises them, protection, companionship, or money, and the gang members wind up becoming victims and having to give money to the gang. And so the third point here I want to highlight is this relationship between embeddedness and the process of exiting gangs. So the research is clear that trying to convince a youth to quit a gang doesn't work. We've all worked with adolescents, and the one thing that I'm sure we can all agree on is that adolescents are often stubborn and fiercely in pursuit of their independence, which makes them extremely resistant to suggestions from adults. So it makes sense that demanding that a youth abandon the gang lifestyle wouldn't work. And since most youth will be in a gang for only a short period of time, many youth will not need intensive interventions. And so it's our job, we need to match the intensity of the intervention with the degree of embeddedness, and also based on the individual's criminogenic risk and need levels, which, as we all know, are those factors associated with criminal behavior and recidivism. So, but the point here is that if we apply too many interventions, we run the risk of tightening the affiliation with gangs. And so our main goal as practitioners working with youth is really to try to prevent further involvement and to decrease the degree of embeddedness in the gang. So again, exiting a gang, I said this earlier, exiting a gang is not a point in time. It's a process that occurs over months and years, quite frankly. And as practitioners, we need to employ strategies that target those push-pull factors as well as those criminogenic risk factors that are actually common to all juvenile justice youth, not just those who are gang involved. And so we need to provide opportunities, for example, for skill development, specifically interpersonal skills and impulse control strategies. We need to increase those healthy pro-social connections in a youth life. And so some specific strategies that have been shown to work are trauma-informed cognitive behavioral treatment, formal mentoring programs using credible messengers, as I mentioned before, and the academic tutoring and vocational programming. Again, I just want to say this again, that these approaches have been consistently documented as effective in the criminal justice literature, not just for gang youth, but for most of the juvenile justice involved youth. Okay. So just a few other surprising discoveries as we comb through the research here. First, research shows that race is not a factor for joining a gang. And the reasons why a youth joins a gang has more to do with their environment. So families and communities that are burdened with poverty, poor quality schools, high crime rates, these things lend themselves for increased gang involvement. And so in these situations, individuals are more likely to view the gang lifestyle as a way to protect their families or earn money to contribute to the families. And so statistically speaking, minority youth are more likely to grow up in communities with these characteristics and therefore have an increased chance of getting gang involved. And so essentially the risk factors that influence youth to adopt the gang lifestyle are not different for minority individuals, but the rate at which they are exposed to these risk factors is greater. So another interesting fact too is that risk factors that correlate with joining a gang are similar for male and females, but there are some differences regarding why or the reason why they decide to join a gang. So young men tend to join gangs for the excitement, the power, or promise of making money, whereas females may join because they want to belong or be accepted. Or a lot of times we see that they already have a friend or a family member that is gang involved. And so we have a whole section on girls and gangs in our toolkit. Folks are interested in taking a peek at that. And then the three of the most powerful factors in gang prevention and intervention approaches are developing relationships, targeting known criminogenic and push-pull factors, and using gang intelligence data. So we've already talked about the research that shows the importance of increasing pro-social peers, positive supportive relationships while youth are in our care. And I also mentioned the prevention and intervention strategies that need to target those push-pull factors, and the use of credible messengers and pro-social activities. And pro-social activities can be things like joining a sports team, engaging in after-school program, participating in church events, taking up a hobby such as music or painting, and those sorts of things. But these are all effective strategies that can help support youth from desisting from the gang lifestyle. So again, over time, putting those things in place and helping them slowly exit the gang. And that last bullet on the slide there is using data and intelligence to identify gang members and monitor gang affiliations. And I'm going to actually leave this to my esteemed colleague, Felix, to elaborate on this piece when he shares his practice considerations in daily operations. So with that, I'll hand the floor over to you, Felix.
Thanks, Sharon. I really appreciate it. So I'd like to, first of all, before I get started, listen, looking at the chat and the people checking in, I am so humbled by such a wide array of, stakeholders and folks in this country who are servicing some of our country's most needy and troubled citizens. And I want to say to you all, thank you so much, because I know, having been a former executive in state government at a government agency and an administrator of an institution for over a decade, it's a thankless job. So I'm telling you, thank you today, and I appreciate you all. And so what I'm here today to do is talk a little bit about I'm going to raise up some of the operational considerations and policy considerations that we came across as we were developing this toolkit. And another thing I want to say is that I see some of you in your jurisdictions, and I'm telling you, we had the opportunity to read some of your policies and to go through some of your approaches and your forms. You all are doing some amazing work. There are some folks out in this country doing some amazing works, which supports Mike's idea that there needs to be updated research and it needs to be funded and conducted. So I want to talk a little bit about the policy and practice considerations. And the first one is assessments, right? One of the things that, that was clear in the research is that agencies should adopt standardized risk and needs assessment tools, which measure factors associated with the propensity for delinquent behavior and gang joining, as Sharon just explained. Not just that they're gang members, but what caused them to become gang members, And again, based on the research that Sharon and I reviewed, there didn't appear to be a single assessment instrument that currently exists, and I'm just going to say currently because things are always changing, to measure all the potential risk factors. But agencies are encouraged to explore a trove of risk factors supported by research and use agency-specific data to identify risk factors assessed at intake. You want to use the right tools for the right young people at the right time to try to get the right outcomes. Some of the tools that you all may be familiar with include the YSL, YLS, CMI, the YASI, or the Savory. And those are, those are assessments that, we use off and on in New Jersey. And I will say this for the record, having gone through this research and this exercise, I don't think that we did a really good job in that when I was in New Jersey, and that's just being honest. We did some things amazingly well, and some things we didn't do well, and that was one of them. And additionally, since risk factors for future gang involvement include a history of trauma for young people, agencies should consider adopting an instrument such as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Tool, or ACE, to capture those. Again, I didn't have a full understanding of assessments when I was in government, like I have now, and I really wish I had the benefit of hindsight. And again, more information about the assessments and the instruments are in the toolkit. All right. And I won't get into understanding push-pull because Sharon did such a wonderful job of explaining that. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Again, Sharon also raised up the idea that, agencies and facilities should employ programs that address antisocial thinking and behaviors that are, and they've been shown to be more effective than specific gang curriculums. I won't name any gang curriculums. I'm sure you know the ones that are out there. But what the research shows is that if you address the criminogenic risk factors, it'll be much more effective than just, kind of off the shelf gang programs, and you should also adopt programs or curricula that are targeted and culturally appropriate. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So in terms of this idea of, addressing antisocial thinking and behaviors, I think it's important for us to understand that, it's not gang membership is not an event, it's a journey. There's an arc. So juvenile justice practitioners should consider interventions with gang-involved youth from two perspectives. And this is what the research says. And that's intervention and prevention. If a youth is already affiliated with gang in the community when you receive them, you should seek to employ appropriate interventions that target risk and need factors identified in whatever standardized risk and needs assessment tool that you choose. So you should be using those to address that. But if a young person is considering joining a gang, or they come into the institution, and I saw someone in the chat ask about this, what to do about young people joining gangs in the facility, that's a reality of these institutions. Kids join gangs for a host of reasons. The staff members should consider intervention strategies that prevent youth from becoming more fully embedded. So this idea of embeddedness, so they should be, trying to keep young people from becoming fully embedded in the gang lifestyle, and help youth, to be less tied to gangs while in the facilities. And there's a number of ways to do that, using classification, using intelligence, and we can get into that in the question and answer period if you like. Also, a super important point that came up during our research was that using targeted programs and curricula help to achieve the best outcomes for young people while they're in their care. So when selecting a gang prevention curriculum or intervention curriculum, it's important to identify the intended population, as research shows that some programs are more effective than others. So universal, kind of cookie cutter approaches have not really been shown to work. All right. In addition, it's important that agencies look to use programs that are culturally appropriate and targeted for their young people. If you have 99% or 80% African Americans in your facility, but all of your teaching material and your curriculum are Caucasian kids, young people may not see themselves in that. The mass majority of your young people may not see themselves in that. And I think it's also important, research has shown that to highlight the differences between why girls join gangs and why boys join gangs. Sharon talked about girls joining for belonging and other reasons, and why boys pretty much join for power and status, and money and all that. And, there's all kinds of myths around why they join. But, if you're, trying to treat young men and young women the same, in terms of, why they join gangs and, your intervention strategy is the same, you're going to miss the mark, because again, girls have needs that, are much more complex than boys, things like housing, homelessness after they leave the gang, because as Sharon indicated, many girls join gangs because family members are connected, and them leaving the gangs, oftentimes mean them leaving their families. So it's important that they're culturally specific and gender specific. I'll move on to the next slide at this point. Another policy and practice consideration that we wanted to hold up was, this whole idea of adopting mentoring programs that include credible messengers as part of the comprehensive, gang reduction strategies. And the reason why it's super important is because of the relatability of a lot of returning citizens. We have, in my career, I was fortunate enough here in the state of New Jersey to have been working with credible messengers since the 90s, the early 90s, So we didn't have legislation that prevented it from happening. And talking to some of my colleagues throughout America, I understand that there are legislative reasons why, your agency or your facilities can't deal with people who, were previously incarcerated or returning citizens. And that's a big mistake. And I encourage you to speak to people about correcting that, because research shows that there is a positive effect to, having these folks in your facilities, And again, another thing that you want to be doing with your treatment is, one of the goals should be to work on to decrease the level of embeddedness, how connected young people are with gangs. I think that most of us know that zero tolerance doesn't work. Kids are where they are when they're there, and you're just trying to move them closer and closer and closer to being pro-social citizens. Again, facilities should consider connecting youth with positive mentors and supports in the communities. These mentors may be business owners, teachers, community advocates, and credible messengers. These individuals can serve as positive role models and may support a youth making good life choices while in a secure facility and in their transition back in the community. I will say this about relationships, just to editorialize just a little bit. One of the things that my experience in New Jersey taught me was that the importance of relationships. We created, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, these relationships with local law enforcement and state police and the federal, DEA, FBI, and all these, kinds of agencies. Because in New Jersey, we had older young people, 18 to 25. Generally, the average age was about 18.9, about 19 years old. And they were deeply, deeply involved in, criminal street gangs and organized crime and things of this nature. And having those relationships with outside law enforcement, and having the kind of relationships that our gang management people had with these young people, we saved a lot of lives. And I'm proud of that. We were able to stop people from being killed in some of these neighborhoods in New Jersey because young people trusted. They had the great relationships with our gang management folks, and they would tell them things that could get them killed. And if you work with gang involved kids, seriously gang involved, that telling thing is a serious thing. But the fact that they had the relationship and the trust and the love for our gang management officers, we were able to call very sensitive information from them and pass it on to law enforcement and people who could intervene before tragedy struck. But the only reason why young people gave us that information is because they trusted the people who they were giving the information to. So this idea of relationships is critically important. And whether your agency exists in a as part of a law enforcement agency or part of a child serving agency or NGL or CBO or whatever it is, if you're dealing with young people who are gang involved, you are part of the tapestry of public safety. And that whole compartmentalization and keeping information safe and keeping young people safe is critically important. And if you're not getting those kinds of real information and real intelligence from kids, it's because you don't have the proper relationships. And that's just something to look at. And I'll move to the next slide. The other thing that I want to highlight based on our research is collaboration intelligence. This is incredibly important. And what we did was we looked at the OJJ, and I suggest that all of you look at the OJJDP comprehensive gang model, particularly the core strategy around community mobilization. As I was going through this exercise as an operations person, I was very impressed with some of the things we were doing. And then I was so shocked that we were doing some things incredibly wrong. One of the things that we did really super well was this part about, developing a multidisciplinary statewide gang intelligence team. And if you don't have this, I highly suggest you talk to somebody about doing it. It's one of the things I think that really made us one of the national leaders in dealing with young people with gangs, So, this whole idea of conducting meetings on a monthly basis, using state police, child protective services, educators from different school districts where, sending districts where these young people are coming from. You'd be shocked how much intel nurses and social workers from high schools throughout your state have about gangs, about young people. They've been working with the families. They know the young people. They know the politics, and you're not going to get everything from everybody. But if you create a gang intelligence kind of network, you can call some really impressive information from that. And again, long after our committee stopped, the relationships were still there. And I could pick up a phone and say, hey, I got this kid coming from North. What do you know about him? I could call a social worker at Elizabeth High School and say, hey, this kid is from Elizabeth High School. What's up with him? Can he read? What's his story? What's his family's? His mother's calling here every day. How should we be dealing with that? And we got some really good operational information, based on that. But again, the OJJDP comprehensive gang model is incredibly, I think, important. It's something that Sharon and I were very impressed with, and especially around the core strategy of community mobilization. And juvenile justice facilities should use multidisciplinary approach when dealing with young people. Classification should, be in support of facility gang management efforts. So your classification, that's one of the most important things in your facility. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. You're moving young people around. Should you put kids from the same gang in the same unit? Are opposing gangs put in the same unit? There's and people get hurt when classification is wrong. Classification system should be used as support of your gang management efforts. And again, gathering gang intelligence data, from outside sources, places like RiskNet and other law enforcement agencies, I think is critical. But the one thing that I do want to highlight as part of this is the importance of compartmentalization. So I know that some of you have heard this whole idea, everybody should know everything, and there should be transparency. Transparency and data intelligence and collection and dissemination can have real adverse public safety effects. Everyone doesn't need to know everything, because if a person's name shows up in some paperwork and that paperwork is sent out to the streets, you have people's grandmothers, families, young people when they come home, being harmed and killed. So everyone should not have access to information. There has to be compartmentalization, and information should be shared on a need-to-know basis. But it should be gathered regularly, and and it should be shared. It should be shared to only folks who need it. If everyone doesn't need to know everything, and that's just the truth of the matter. I'm going on to the next slide, and that, folks, I'm going to pass it back to you, Mina.
Thank you. That was great. All of you had fantastic comments, and we're getting some very interesting comments in the chat. We can address some of them, but for the remainder of our time, I have some questions for our panelists, and we want to we want to make some time at the end to address a few of the questions that we've received in the chat. So can someone push off to the next slide, please? Thank you. Thank you. So Mike, let's start. From an operational perspective, what are the 3 critical actions that should be taken by juvenile justice administrators that you have seen as a result of your work?
Well, part of me wants to just say, just do what Felix just talked about for the last 20 minutes. But, you know, there's a lot. I think it's important to recognize there's no easy answer to any of this. And it really requires an intensive strategy to really manage these issues within the facility setting. With that said, though, I think a few things that really come to my mind would be, one, you have to know and establish the right type of facility culture and environment. You know, what does your facility feel like and look like when you walk through the facility? What does the relationship look like between your direct care staff and the youth in the facility? Is it one where they are really engaged with one another and trying to provide positive feedback and interactions and mentoring? Or is your culture and your facility relationship where your direct care staff are just standing back in the corner and just observing the youth as they're essentially doing not a lot in the day rooms, right? Those things are important. I think you have to pay attention to fear for safety of both staff and youth in your facility, because that fear really does drive an awful lot of the incidents of violence that occur within the facility setting. And a lot of those incidents of violence can be directly attributed to gang violence and gang interaction, gang affiliations. And I think it's important to note, it's not always specific to gang affiliation. Sometimes we see an awful lot of it can just be neighborhood association, right? It could be, you could have challenges between neighborhoods in a particular jurisdiction. As facility administrators, you absolutely have to pay attention to the data. You know, you have to be looking at critical outcome measures every single week, at a minimum on a monthly basis, looking at things like your fights, your assaults, other types of incidents of violence occurring in your facility, uses of force, room confinement, but digging deeper into those issues and those incidents to determine, you know, is there any type of gang affiliation, gang involvement with these incidents? And sometimes they're really hard to determine. You also need to look at, you know, if you have a youth who doesn't generally get involved in violence, particularly an assault on a staff member or assault on another youth, what drove that? A lot of times it can be nothing more than gang pressure that is happening within the facility setting itself. So you, as an administrator, you absolutely have to really pay attention to all those things and more.
Thank
I'll
you.
jump in and add a few things. Although I have not run a facility, I've been providing technical assistance in New Jersey to the Juvenile Justice Commission since 2018. And as I shared earlier, we've been focused on healing as a strategy to address the trauma that has resulted in many young people ending up gang involved. And I have been, for the past 4 years, really on the front line in the front row with many of the young people who were returning home from New Jersey, who had been significantly gang involved, had committed serious violence in the community, as well as in the facility. And the Healing Circle work, within 6 months of its inception, caused aggressive incidents to plummet in the facility. And as we've been supporting several of the young men as they returned home, what we've really learned and what was underscored is that safety and healing require, as Felix and Sharon said, trusting relationships with responsible and relatable adults. So juvenile justice administrators should look for ways to partner with relatable professionals such as credible messengers. Now, I would add credible messengers who are also doing their own healing work and who are engaged in addressing their trauma, because that not just someone who has returned home from incarceration. And I believe I saw someone post a question in the chat about the research. Now, I have not seen any research around credible messengers, but I will tell you in the past 4 years, from a firsthand perspective, that the young adults who we have been supporting and mentoring, when they are supported by individuals who are helping them in a non-judgmental way, we are seeing true transformation. They are going, the other action I think that administrators should pay attention to is, while you have these young people in your care, I think Sharon was mentioning this, they are so behind developmentally that they really need to recapture or learn what they missed when they were young teenagers. They're not going to be able to return home and compete in the employment field if they do not have an opportunity to learn professional development, communication skills, how to address social, emotional, and regulate their emotions. All those things are critically important. So the more you can create opportunities for that type of development and learning, the better. They're also going to need to repair their relationships with often with their family members, particularly if they've been in your custody and care for a number of years. They're not the same person as when they were home in the community. And so finding ways to create opportunities for them to reconnect with their families and repair issues that could become triggers in a bad direction when they return home if not addressed is important. And the last thing I'll lift up as being critical is helping them to learn some skill sets that will help them to get a job, have a job skill, a living wage job. Because if you cannot help them position themselves to live a different type of life, a responsible life, then they're more than likely going to be pulled back when they return home. All of this is not just about what's happening in the facility. It's about supporting these young people so they can return home and not be a threat to community safety. So they really need to work together.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for making that statement about credible messengers. That is a question we get often. Mention, before we go on to the next question, just mention a little bit more about healing circles, that it's not something that's informal, but there are best practices. Don't go into detail about, all of the evidence, but just that healing circles are transformative, but there are, it's not something that's just informal.
Yes, there are various types of approaches and various types of models. There are approaches that address conflicts from a restorative perspective, and then there are other approaches that address trauma. But it is really important to find ways to address the wound, to repair the wounds that people are carrying from their traumatic experiences so that they can be less triggered. And then they're starting to be studied. We at Casey are doing some evidence building around how to evaluate healing. So stay tuned. It's something that's important. And I think different organizations around the country are starting to have a lot of success with this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, one other point that I think is important to make here, as facility administrators, as you're managing these situations, you also have to keep in mind the reentry transitional process back to the community, because that is a big piece of the intervention strategies that need to be in place, as Tanya was just speaking to, right? If we don't set up the right successful plan for those youth to return to the community, they are much more likely to fail. They are much more likely to continue to be gang involved. So you absolutely have to pay attention to what are you doing for those reentry strategies, and are you making sure that there is a successful plan in place to include
Great.
placement.
And you're pointing out, which all of you have pointed out already, that you can't work in silos in this. This is a comprehensive effort. So let's go to our next question regarding gang recruitment that might occur in facilities. Felix, what practices or strategies have you seen used to mitigate or reduce gang involvement in facilities?
Well, thanks so much for the question. So my experience, what I've seen that I thought was super effective, and again, we talked about it. I talked about it as I was lifting up some of those operational things. I think that the three most important things that I've seen, in my career, in my experience, and moving around, talking to my colleagues all over America, when you have a strong classification system, you can catch a lot of gang activity. You can catch a lot of gang activity. You can get a lot of good intelligence through classification. So I think that, having a strong classification system, one that has, fidelity to your classification process, one that's an objective classification system that uses a scoring system, but also has, including gang management people in your classification process. It just shouldn't be classification folks. Classification should be a multidisciplinary event. You have administrators in classification, you have gang management in classification. And so everywhere a young person is moving around and whoever they're interacting with, you got your finger on that button. The other thing that I think is super important, again, is having relationships with outside law enforcement and social service organizations. You'd be shocked how much information that Child Protective Services folks have about gangs and families and the family structure, where young people come from. If you call up a social worker and say, hey, what do you know about this family? They can give you all kinds of information. And I don't know about other places, but New Jersey, government agencies are very siloed. They don't share information, even though they're dealing with the same, these multi-systemic young people. There's a blackout. And the third thing, and I think the most important thing, is not giving too much authority to gangs. Not giving too much authority to it. You go to some facilities, oh, he's big homie such and such, and yeah, okay, you're a gang member. I know who you are. Here's how, this is our place, not yours, and we're going to treat you like a human being. I don't care that you're in a gang. Doesn't mean anything. We got these services for you, and as long as you don't do gang stuff here, you're going to be treated fairly. But when you start doing gang stuff, we're going to step on you, and that's how it has to go. Having those relationships with young people and marshaling the gang leadership, not shying away from that. If you get into the ego thing, oh, we run it, we don't have to talk to them. No, you'd be shocked at how powerful gang members are with other gang members, even opposing gang members. I'm not from the school of thought that says you separate them. No, because you're teaching them to hate each other and you're reinforcing negative interactions in the streets. Put them together.
Yeah. I completely agree with that strategy. When I was in Indiana, we were having major gang problems, gang recruitment, gang violence within our facility, and just struggling because there's nothing out there to help guide these practices. What are the best practices for managing gang involved youth in the facility setting? There's just nothing out there. Hopefully until now, hopefully our toolkit will help guide everyone in that direction. But as a last ditch effort, because we did the same thing. We typically separated the gangs within the facility setting and continued to perpetuate that hating, right? The gangs are rivals, right? They're going to continue to cause problems. So we created a unit specific to those youth in the facility who were gang identified, who were the leaders recruiting and causing the majority of the violence in the facility, and we made them all live together. And we had remarkable outcomes in that strategy, right? We did not see the violence continue. They figured it out. They figured out how to live with one another. And within a few weeks, they're playing basketball, they're playing chess, they're interacting with it like you would hope that they would do. So yeah, you can't always do that, right? You have to be careful, but
Yep.
I would definitely, say to everyone that is a strategy you should clearly think about and consider as well.
So with careful planning, the data and intelligence behind it, the relationships with staff, the safety issues, then that's an excellent strategy to move forward, to not re-emphasize the hate, but to teach everybody to get along. That's excellent.
Create healthy normative interactions with young
Mhm.
people. You know, just using the system to help you to create that, you know?
Excellent.
And
So,
one last thing,
uh-huh.
the staff doesn't run the facilities, the young people do. All right. And so if you're smart, you use them to help you run your place. It's their place, and you give them that authority and they take it when you give it to them. This is your place. And that's my thought anyway.
Thank you. Any comments from Tanya and Sharon on this one? Okay, so we have one more question. I think we may have some time to take other questions. I see all kinds of questions in the chat. But before that, I'd like to start with Sharon with this next question. What strategies are important to consider when preparing youth impacted by gangs to return to their families and the community after they leave the facility?
So I guess I'd like to start off saying that, obviously reentry starts the day a youth arrives and not 2 months before they leave facilities. And so facilities really need to be strategic, I think, in their approach. And so what I mean by that is, assessing those push-pull factors, knowing what those criminogenic factors are, and building the treatment plan so that those align and that your interventions align with what you're, targeting. So being clear about what you're targeting, and obviously having a robust reentry plan, again, the day a youth arrives or shortly thereafter, is a critical piece. And so the second piece I guess I would emphasize is that facility staff really need to make a concerted effort to connect youth again with those pro-social supports, such as mentors, business owners, family members that aren't, gang involved, advocates in their local communities. And so any way we can do that. So, this may involve having mentors and supports coming to the facility months prior to the youth release, or better yet, maybe ideally being involved the entire time that the youth is in the facility. Because that establishes, again, those pro-social relationships are critical to helping youth, all youth, even non-gang involved youth, and really helping them turn the corner and staying crime-free ultimately. And then I guess in addition to that, I would just kind of bang this drum again about the importance of, pro-social activities. So setting youth up for success, like getting them involved, thinking about, again, and this would be in the reentry plan from the day the kid arrives, and you're working the plan the whole time to make sure, but when the youth leaves, that they're going to be joining an after-school program. They're going to be joining a sports team. They're going to be actively participating in church programs. They're going to be enrolling in vocational certifications or college classes and so forth. So those pro-social activities are really, really critical. And again, it doesn't start a month before the youth leaves. This is what the end goal. We have to have the end goal in mind and be working that program or working that plan the entire time the youth is there. And I guess the last thing I guess I want to say is really about having a clear plan for what kinds of supports, or how are we going to help youth, for example, apply for jobs or get the driver's license or apply for housing. We heard from the young people that we interviewed that was one of the things that actually helped them. And of course, like we always teach, a lot of folks teach, some of those skills like resume building or, how to apply for a job while in the facility. But the reality is that a lot of these youth have been in the facility for a long time. And even though I know what a resume looks like, or I know I filled out an application for an apartment as practice inside the facility, where are those supports on the outside to actually help them make that happen on the once they return to the community? So I would just encourage facility folks to be thinking about what partners, parole staff or whoever it may be, who might provide the support to actually get those day-to-day things, like, again, the job, applying for jobs, the driver's license, and the housing piece, to make sure that actually happens when the youth gets back to the community.
Thank you.
I was going
Tanya?
to jump in and add, because everything that Sharon said, I underscore. From a practical perspective, you all come from so many different states. It's important to understand what age the young person is, or the young adult is. There's a difference between a teen and a young adult. In New Jersey, they're keeping young people until the age of 25. And so a lot of the young people that I've been supporting over the past 4 years are older 20s. It's important to understand whether they're parents, because they'll need lots of different types of supports if they're parents. It's important to understand, as I said in the beginning, what is their status in the organization, and are they going to be going back to the same neighborhoods where they were harmed and committed harm? Or is there going to be a safety issue? Well, we found over the past 4 years that some of the young adults who did best actually left the state and lived with relatives. We also piloted a healing home in DC to try to get young people away from the communities that were so violent and that were really pulling them back in, that pull that Sharon was talking about, or creating an expectation of retaliation for things that they had done years ago. And then in terms of the supports, again, the relationships need to be built before, so there's an actual warm handoff, because young people do not trust. What we found works is a support team, a team of individuals, so that there is someone that they can contact and who's going to respond pretty much anytime. So creating those system community partnerships, if they're going to be on parole or probation or community supervision, it's important to have a community organization that's connected with the young person, working together as a team. And then, as I said earlier, kind of building those emotional supports, so that, because a lot of these young people are also really prone to depression. And so having someone to connect when they're having their low moments can keep them in the right direction.
Okay. Any other comments on
Yeah,
this? This panel.
really quickly.
Mhm.
Really quickly, I'd say that another way to use credible messengers, and it's something that I did when I was in government, and I think it's something that other people should consider. Credible messengers, most times who come from those neighborhoods where those kids come from, they were the ones who tore up those neighborhoods, and they have a lot of authority with the people who are currently tearing those neighborhoods up. So having that person to go speak, like in public housing in a lot of our cities and federal, I think the feds is the rule too. If you get caught selling drugs, right, or someone sells drugs, they're not allowed to live there, and the parents have to move and all that kind of thing. So, you have credible messengers, and you have families that are rightly suspicious of government agencies. They don't see you as juvenile justice and the good guys. No, you're part of the government. And what happens is, if I admit that I'm bringing this young person back to my house who sold drugs to the government, I might lose my housing. I might lose my welfare benefits. I may lose, all my childcare. I may lose all kinds of things. So what I created, and I'm saying it out loud now, is I would send credible messengers who I knew these people and say, look, tell the person this is what we're trying to do. It gives the families plausible deniability, and it gives us some credibility with the families, using these credible messengers who can walk into the house and say, hey, look, these people, good people, all right? They don't want to mess with your housing. Are you going to be able to keep this kid here? Yes or no? And I think that's the way to use credible messaging. I think that's a really good strategy. Use them to interface with the community. They got more authority than you do. You're the enemy to a lot of these families. Thank you.
That's a really valid point, because there are so many barriers that we don't even realize within the different states, within the different jurisdictions, and those have to be addressed. Any other comments from our panel before I turn?
One last comment.
Go ahead.
For me, I think we have to pay attention to the fact that, for all the right reasons, many jurisdictions have raised the age, and some of our facility populations are becoming older and older. And we have to consider that as also a factor, but also consider that as part of, when you're thinking about reentry strategies, making sure that, as Tanya spoke to, that you're preparing those youth as best possible. So you're actually meeting the needs of the older youth population and providing the appropriate vocational skills that are necessary for them to be able to go out and be successful. On the flip side of that, we have to also pay attention to how are we training staff to work with the older youth population, and are we even doing anything different? Most jurisdictions are not. We still continue to train staff as though they're working with a much younger population. The population is 12 to 16 years old, and it's just not the case anymore. And we have to better prepare our staff to work with the older population.
That's a good point. Any other comments before? There's so much coming in from questions from the audience, and there's so many things that all of you have brought up that I'd love to discuss further, but are there, in the interest of time, are there any other comments you would like to make, any of you? Okay, then why don't we move to some of the questions I've been seeing in the coming through in the chats. Someone asked about the topic of gang designations and how do you recommend balancing providing facility and program staff with information to keep youth safe and identify potential conflicts, while also not labeling youth as gang members and opening them up to negative consequences and impacts of that label. Who wants to try that one?
I can take a shot at it. So for me, much to the chagrin of the officers union, yeah, I didn't tell people what gangs young people were in. If you weren't part of gang management, you weren't part of classification, you weren't a housing unit supervisor, you didn't need to know. You treat all the kids the same. You don't need to know who has sex offenses, who has homicides. You don't need to know any of that. Use universal precautions, treat everybody the same. When you give too much authority to people and too much information, they're out at the bars having a drink, talking. They're in the housing units talking. Oh, such and such is over there from sex, money, murder. Oh, such and such is over there from the folks. Oh, it's a GD over here. They start watching A&E and YouTube and getting like they're gang professionals. No, my recommendation is too much information is a dangerous thing. My recommendation would be treat all young people the same, have your intelligence, but compartmentalize. That's my recommendation.
That's excellent. Any other comments on that? No, I'm getting recognition. Okay, we have another question from Rhode Island Training School. We have a significant problem with gang violence within our youth population here. And many of the youth hold the belief that once they have a membership with the gang, there is no exiting the gang. Can you address this in your presentation? So I think Sharon, I think you said something about the embeddedness as well as it's not an on-off status. It's not a yes or no thing. It's a progress, a procession. And so to address that, youth who think that it might be an all in or all out, that's where it comes in, building these other relationships, building these other positive relationships with mentors or other adults or people that will help them understand that they can start stepping back from those negative behaviors, start opening up opportunities for them for positive, different, positive opportunities and a different lifestyle, getting all those things that Tanya said about helping those supports. And eventually they'll learn that it's not I have to exit the gang, but just move back. Just as it is a gradual procession in, it's a gradual movement out of that gang. And it looks different for every individual. So I hope that helps to address that question.
And I think well said.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say well said on that. And I think that is also the value of credible messengers, because they've been there, right? They have the real life experience and they can talk to the youth and say, yeah, I've been there, man. It's scary leaving the gang, but here's the deal. And here's what we have to offer. And again, I mean, that's why it's also important to know why they entered the gang from the beginning, because if it wasn't just about money, let's hypothetically, if it was just about money or belonging, the reality is if we're giving them vocational training and giving them skills, the credible messengers would say, hey, you're certified now in, IT stuff or, AI or whatnot. You know, and so we're saying now you're going to make 100 grand when you get out. So you want to stay on the straight and narrow. So again, those pro-social supports and are very important. Those relationships, particularly again with folks with lived experience, I think that's really powerful.
Any other comments on that question? Okay, here's another one I see. How do you work, or what strategies would you suggest for working with the youth in the facility who's returning to a home where the parents are gang members, but the youth wants to exit the gang life?
I know Tanya wants to jump on this one because I will though. See,
I will as well. I'll go after you, Felix.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Family reunification is a tricky thing, and as a construct, I agree with it. And it sounds good if you say it fast, because a lot of the young people who come to our facilities, you know, putting them back, they're re-traumatized by the same folks who got them there. A lot of these kids, their families are the reasons they're there. So why would you place them back with their families? They've killed people in their neighborhoods. They've shot people. They've done all manner of things. You putting them right back in the pressure cooker? No, the strategy is relocation. Figuring out a way to get the young person out of their neighborhoods. Every young person should not go back to families, and certainly they shouldn't go back to a gang involved, you know, parent who's actively gang involved. That's just, you know, you should not support it. You know, I mean, you have to if you have to, but you know, my recommendation would be relocation.
There should always be
You know,
a better strategy for a reentry placement plan than returning a youth to gang involved living situation, gang involved parents. I actually read that question in the chat earlier, and I pulled it out because I wanted to make sure that we addressed it, because it is extremely important, because it happens way too often. It is ridiculous how many times we return youth to that type of environment and expect a good outcome from it. And it's just sheerly poor reentry planning and investigation. So we have to we get relocation 100%. There are probably other members within the family that you could place the youth with who are not gang involved, who could be a positive influence on them. But it really reminded me of one particular incident that we had in Indiana. We had a gang involved youth. We had him for several years. He was heavily involved in the gang. He caused incredible amounts of violence within the facility the first couple of years. We worked hard with that youth. He went to that gang unit that I spoke to earlier. After a while, he finally separated himself from that life. You could absolutely, when speaking to him, you knew he had turned the corner. He wanted to change. He no longer wanted anything to do with that life. He was going to school. He was doing everything positive he could be doing within the facility. Release day came. I actually walked him out of the facility to release to his parents. And there was mom and about 6 other gang members just waiting for him to come out the facility. And I literally could feel him change within seconds. As soon as he recognized who was there waiting for him, his whole demeanor changed. And you could tell that his hope and success after release just got sucked out of it. And I just looked at him, we looked at each other, and I said, well, that's not happening. So we both walked back into the facility, and then he stayed there until we could find him a better, more suitable release plan. So absolutely happens all the time, and you have to make sure that you have steps in place to prevent that from happening.
I'm going to add one quick idea, because it's something that we worked on as part of our technical assistance with New Jersey. Right now, it's important to add independent living to the continuum of options. And so New Jersey was able to repurpose a couple of properties that they were owned and turn them into independent living homes for young people, so that they would have an option to not go back to their neighborhoods when they were unsafe and violent, and families perhaps that either couldn't house them or might not have been able to help them in their transition out of the gang. So that is something in terms of service delivery that it is important right now to start thinking about and start figuring out, so that can be an option.
Mina, can I add one other thing, please?
Absolutely.
First of all, Mike, thanks for doing what you did with that kid and for all the other kids you helped. That is an amazing thing you did. And you highlighted something that I believe in, and which made me a maverick in some ways and an innovator in other ways. And it got me in trouble a lot too, is this idea that people who are in positions of authority and decision-making, like you were, Mike, have to have the courage to step outside the policy. And I'm not saying to be breaking the law or anything like that, but to rewrite policy that serves you. Policy should help us to elevate our ability to help young people, and not policies that are rooted in fear and racism and lack of cultural understanding. But, you know, this idea that you have to stretch, that was Mike Dempsey, chapter 3. That wasn't some Indiana policy. I can guarantee you that, because I know too much about policies. Decision makers have to have the heart to step outside the policy. So thank you for doing that, Mike. And for the folks who are attending this, you know, I highly recommend you go to your policy makers and your leadership and look at your policies on transition and see which ones are old. Some of these policies, 80s, 70s, 60s, they don't even apply. You know, things are different. You know, it ain't folks in GD, you know, folks and peoples and it's all hybrid gangs everywhere. It's wild stuff going on. Everything needs to change. Thanks, Mina.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for just sharing these experiences and this information. And I recommend that everyone go to the toolkit and review the toolkit. Again, to our audience, there are more questions coming up about policy and safety issues and a few things. I just can't get to them all in this matter. So again, to our audience, if you have additional questions that were not addressed today, please reach out to the National Gang Center or to the panelists here. I believe their contact information will be posted. Yes, their contact information is posted. So please reach out. These are incredibly important points to consider, you know, policies to consider, the safety issues, the safety and success of our young people, of our staff, of our communities, all of that. So as a reminder, I want you to please fill out our evaluation forms. I'm going to turn this over to Sterling in a moment to provide additional closeout and comments about feedback and certificates. I want to thank our panelists so much for this. This was an idea we started talking about last year, I believe, until we made it come to fruition in this webinar. And I also want to thank our incredible staff at IIR and our National Gang Center staff who helped support this webinar and bring it all about. So I turn it over to you, Sterling. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.